coming for our wonderful program that's being presented this evening. And this is Devil's Gate History Club. So what we do is we have a can back there on our, you can hang it down, and that, if you add a little bit to that as you leave, it will be appreciated because we pay nothing to the community center for having this here. So it goes to the community center to maintain what we have in this wonderful room, which, by the way, used to be the courthouse. So we have other people coming here now. So,
last month, next month,
go ahead.
no, Bears, we're going to announce next month's program.
What is that?
Okay, next month's program
Okay, next month's program.
is the Bears Ears National Monument.
What is it?
Who's doing it?
It's a,
So that's better.
I can't remember his name, but Beth Sagstetter knows him, I believe, from Fort Lewis College, but I'm...
His name is
Oh, hi, Beth. Beth knows. Hi, Beth.
Dr. Andrew Goldberg. He's a professor at Fort Lewis College.
Did everybody hear
No,
that?
I'm going to stop right one moment so we can all hear it.
Quiet down.
Okay, Tom? No, what is it? Okay, give us what our next month is.
It is Dr. Andrew Gulliford,
Yes.
professor at Fort Lewis College, who will be talking on Bears Ears National Monument. I look forward to that. Hi, Beth. Nice to see you. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. We also have a can back there. I don't know whether it is now.
It's there.
It's there, but it's right by the door. And we pay nothing to have this wonderful program here in the community center. So if we all put a little tidbit in that can, it would help the community center maintain this hall for the rest of us and for other programs that we have. So welcome everybody, and I'm going to let Tom take over here and introduce our speakers for tonight.
John Sprunger and Allison Knotts have been Georgetown residents for only 3 years. But in that 3 years period of time, they've become very involved in the community and very interested in the history of Georgetown and the area. So they're here tonight to give their interpretation of two famous characters who I will let them introduce. John and Allison.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for waiting an extra week to come see this presentation. We're so glad you're here. As Tom said, we are doing a double feature, and we're very excited to present on these two individuals who share a determined, adventurous spirit. One is a British explorer and writer, and the other is an attorney, educator, historian, statesman, the list goes on. And we're going to be looking specifically at their connection to Georgetown and how their writings offer very contrasting snapshots to our town's history. So again, as Tom said, we're residents here in Georgetown. When we moved in 2021, we were very captivated, one by Isabella Bird's experience as a solo female traveler on the western frontier in the late 1800s, and inspired by James Grafton Rogers alike for living an extremely accomplished life during the early 1900s.
Fortunately, they were both excellent writers, with Isabella Bird's A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains, and Mr. Rogers wrote My Rocky Mountain Valley. Allison and I started reading those books shortly after we moved here and got interested in these two folks. And when we were asked to do a history presentation, these were the two best folks that we could think of to do. They're not explicitly linked in any way. A lot of people are like, oh, why are we you know. But they're both connected to Georgetown, and we'll weave in some links along the way, actually, that are interesting here and there. So, all right, Allison's going to tell you a little bit more about Isabella Bird.
Okay, So let's start from the top. Isabella Bird is a product of the Victorian era. She was born in Yorkshire, England on October 15th, 1831. She is the eldest daughter in her family. Her father's a reverend. Her sister's name is Henrietta, and you're going to hear a bit more about her later on. In her younger years, she's developing a curiosity for the natural world and the flora and fauna that she sees all around her on the English countryside. She's becoming very proficient at horseback riding, but unfortunately, she's in a lot of pain. She has spinal ailments. She's suffering from, they say, headaches and insomnia, and she's very much in danger of becoming an invalid early on in her life. So in 1850, at the age of 19, a tumor is removed from her spine. However, the surgery is only partially successful. She's still having these physical ailments, and she's prescribed from her doctor to try a change of scenery and a sea voyage to cure what's ailing her. We see this a lot in the Victorian era. It's fresh air as sort of this kind of cure-all, and I'm very much glad that she was prescribed that because she has a life of adventure to follow. So in 1854, she first travels to America. This is a 7-month journey that is funded by £100 from her family, and it's the basis of her first book, which is called English Women in America. And this trip, we see her in Canada, in the eastern United States. It's kind of just cut and dry observations about American culture and geography. But her overarching learning is that as an unattended young lady, she is able to travel alone very freely in a way that's not possible in England at that time. So in 1858, after her father's passing, herself, her mother, and her sister relocate to Edinburgh, Scotland. And then in 1866, Isabella's mother passes away, and Isabella and her sister settle in the Isle of Mull, also in Scotland. During this time, we see that her writings are starting to circulate, and she's going to use that to fund future travels. So in Scotland, when I Googled it, it looked like a beautiful setting. However, she's a restless spirit, and she was pretty uninterested in a quiet domestic lifestyle. It's starting to bring back some of her childhood illnesses. So she continues to plan longer voyages for her health. And then in 1872, just shy of 40 years old, she travels to Hawaii, which is known as the Sandwich Islands back then. This is a 6-month stay that she has in Hawaii. She's riding horseback, she's braving flood and fleas, camping on the slopes of Mauna Loa as volcanoes crash and roar around her. And it's truly here that Isabella has found her freedom, and it's exhilarating. About Hawaii, she writes, "Suddenly, just above and in front of us, gory drops were tossed in the air, and springing forward, we stood on the brink of Halemaumau, which was about 35 feet below us. I think we all screamed, I know we all wept, but we were speechless, for a new glory and terror had been added to the earth, and it is the most unutterable of wonderful things." So this is her writing style. Just wait till she gets to Georgetown. So needless to say, she's enchanted by Hawaii. And this period of time, she has 2 breakthrough learnings that defy all Victorian norms for women. And one, after riding side saddle up a volcano and finding that very painful and very difficult, she decides to ride astride, which is facing forward on a horse, clothespin style. And then to make that possible, she's embraced clothing where she can ride astride. So, and we'll see her wearing this dress. She's calling it the Hawaiian's Lady Holiday Riding Dress. But spoiler alert, that's just baggy pants. But it was a very very big deal, don't get me wrong. So she's shown us she's not adverse to sleeping on the ground with the saddle as her pillow, and it turns out her adventures have just begun. From Hawaii, she travels to California, and she makes her way to Lake Tahoe and then the Rocky Mountains. So from September to December 1873, this is the basis for her next book, A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains. It's entirely comprised of letters to her sister, Henrietta, just like her previous books. And she's making this trek during winter, which is incredible. She's often ending her days with her feet frozen to her stirrups and needing to keep her ink for letter writing on the stove so it doesn't freeze solid. But alas, she's completely overcome by the mountains, even with those hardships. She says, "As I write, I am only 25 miles from the Rockies, and they are gradually gaining possession of me. I can look at and feel nothing else." So where did she go in Colorado? Early on, she states that Estes Park is the goal of her journey. This map appears in her book, and we get numbered destinations, so it kind of gives us a bird's eye view. Just to say, this is over 800 miles total traveled by her, solo on horseback, in Colorado. But we see her in Denver, Colorado Springs, Manitou Springs, Georgetown, of course. And I just want to note that getting to Estes Park initially was not a straightforward task. So when she arrives in Fort Collins, she's taken way far north above Estes Park by someone who's guiding her, said he knew the way. Clearly he didn't, because they swing down to Longmont. And that was actually a godsend, because she does meet some individuals who can take her to Estes Park from there. So that whole thing took 2 weeks. It's a riveting read. She says she doesn't think she's going to make it to Estes Park. It's slipping from her grasp. But when she finally does get to Estes Park, with understandable enthusiasm, her first letter starts in all capital letters, "Estes Park!" 3 exclamation points. "Everything that is rapturous and delightful, the very place I have been seeking." In a following letter about Estes, she says, "This is surely one of the most entrancing spots on earth. Oh, that I could paint with pen or brush." So in a quick note about Victorian-era letter writing, which I found really interesting, this is a technique called crossing. And you can see up on the screen, you write in one direction, flip the paper 90 degrees, write in the other direction. You can do this up to 3 more times on a single piece of paper, creating a very tight grid. And that was developed to save on postage. It's extremely hard to read. Very luckily, only a few of her letters were written this way, but I found it very, very interesting, and also, yikes. So through her writings, we learn that Estes Park is very, very remote, very sparsely populated, but it's these exact reasons why she is entranced by the scenery, the solitude, and the wildlife. While she's in Estes Park, she's staying at Griff Evans' cabin. This is making her perhaps the first boarder in what is now Rocky Mountain National Park. Because she's such an accomplished horse rider, she's actually going to assume the life of a horse rancher, because Griff Evans' cabin is on a horse ranch. So she's quickly winning the respect in this very rugged, male-dominated landscape, and is accepted as equal and very much valued for her strength and endurance. So if Isabella Bird is the most interesting person you might meet on the Western frontier in the 19th century, I'm going to go ahead and say Jim Nugent is the second most interesting person. She befriends Jim Nugent very early on. He's also known as Rocky Mountain Jim, and I'll try to refer to him as such going forward. He is the self-appointed gatekeeper of Estes Park. So his property sits right at the base of Estes Park, and you have to cross through to get to the area. And so he's interrogating new arrivals as they come into the area. And if he doesn't like you, he's going to send you on the wrong trail. So for this reason and frequent bar fights and heavy whiskey consumption, he is known as a ruffian and a desperado. His background is pretty murky. We do know that he's making a living as a guide and a trapper. And as Isabella is getting to know Jim, his tenderness and chivalrous side is starting to come through. He can quote poetry. They have philosophical conversations as they're riding horseback through Estes Park. But Jim made his intentions very well known when, upon their first meeting, he says, "I hope you will allow me the pleasure of calling on you." And my goodness, I could not put the book down after that moment. So this illustration on screen is kind of the best of our knowledge. There are no photographs that exist of Rocky Mountain Jim, but Isabella describes him as such. One eye was entirely gone, and the loss made one side of his face repulsive, while the other might have been modeled in marble. Of his genius and chivalry to women, there does not appear to be any doubt, but he is a desperate character and the subject to ugly fits when people think it is best to avoid him. So if Rocky Mountain Jim has made his intentions known, this is what Isabella says about him. A man any woman might love, but no sane woman would marry. Now, we can do an entire talk on their sort of perceived romantic relationship. That's not my focus tonight, but maybe that'll make you want to read the book. So Jim and Isabella become traveling companions and friends from this point. He's teaching her mountaineering and survival skills. She's never criticized for being a woman or traveling alone. And with Jim's encouragement, they actually summit Long's Peak together. And her account is very harrowing. So we see during their summit to Long's Peak, Isabella is wearing Griff Evans boots, which are 2 sizes too large. She's experiencing vertigo the entire time. They're traversing chasms with 3,000 feet drops and crossing over what she says are knife-like ridges. She says that Jim dragged me up like a bale of goods by sheer force of muscle. So she doesn't sugarcoat the experience. It was very, very difficult. But to give you some context for this accomplishment, Long's was first summited by European American explorers in 1868. So here we are now just 5 years later, and the pair have had this incredible success. And so even in that metric, Isabella is certainly one of the first very few women to have accomplished this amazing feat. So the moment you've all been waiting for, in December, Isabella sets off to Georgetown with the sole purpose of visiting Green Lake. Isabella says about Georgetown that Georgetown is the only town I've seen in America to which the word picturesque could be applied. That's nice. So I want to quickly paint the picture of what Georgetown looked like in 1873 when she was here. This is just 9 years after the initial discovery of silver, so town is booming. We have investors, entrepreneurs, businesses to support the mining activities like banks and hotels and merchants. An 1880 census tells us that there was over 3,000 folks in town. And Isabella also writes that she thinks Georgetown is the highest town in the U.S. And I hate to spoil it, I did Google, and in that year, 1873, Alma had just been established, and they would actually have been the highest town. So sorry to take that away from her. But despite our remote location, Georgetown has an incredibly vibrant cultural and social scene during this time. We have a theater, social clubs, saloons, and tourists are coming in to visit natural wonders like our Bridal Veil Falls, and also to tour mines. I love this photo. We can date it very accurately because we see the Presbyterian Church just under construction here, and this is right before the construction of the old school, which will go in that empty lot up there. But all in all, this is a very happening place. So in contrast to its vibrancy, Isabella is going to write about what she calls the blight of mining. What she sees in Georgetown, she writes, "Many a heart has been broken for the few finds which have been made along these hillsides. All the ledges are covered with charred stumps, a picture of desolation, where nature had made everything grand and fair." So Isabella arrives at her hotel. She learns that no one has been to Green Lake in 5 weeks. As you may have deduced at this point, she does not give up. That does not deter her whatsoever. She requests a horse to make the journey up there, and the stable gives very explicit instructions for the horse. She says, if it's the English lady traveling in the mountains, she can have the horse, but not anyone else. So this is incredible. Her reputation is getting around. She's becoming very well known. And that's actually just one example of her reputation spreading. Okay, so why Green Lake was my big question when I first read the book. You know, any of us right now could just pop up Guanella Pass. It's lovely, you know. However, back then, unbeknownst to me before I started this research, it was a very highly publicized destination for otherworldly recreation. I found an article in the Rocky Mountain Times called the Georgetown Excursion. And that's a trip that you would take as a tourist from Denver. You start in Denver, you take a train to Floyd Hill, you switch to Stagecoach, you stop in Idaho Springs for a mineral bath, you get to Georgetown by 5, and then you take a pony up to Green Lake and have a picnic, watch the sunset. So it's becoming, like I said, a popular destination to recreate. And speaking of advertising and how it's being portrayed in the mass media, I found this almost daily advertisement in our local newspaper in the summer of 1869, so this is like quite early on, that's calling Green Lake the pleasure grounds. So how could you resist? But so they were developing a name recognition for Green Lake and kind of creating lure around it as a destination. So we're going to fast forward back to tourism in 1873. As mining is flourishing, Green Lake has become a destination for recreation and leisure activities. I was delighted to find some just in the newspaper archives. There's an article, or rather an advertisement, says, "Sail one of the highest lakes in the world." And because of journalistic integrity, they did change that statement. Years later, I saw a similar advertisement that said, "Highest place in the world to get a boat ride." So why Green Lake? But between publicity and word of mouth, this seems like a fair explanation as to why Isabella wants to go here. Or is it? So I'm in the newspaper archives and I came upon something so exciting. Rocky Mountain Gym was in Georgetown in May of 1873. So the article says nothing about why he was here, just that he was attacked by a bear 2 years prior and survived that. But I was delighted to find this. Now, I'm going to bring in one more character, and maybe that'll close the loop.
2 months before. Just a few months before.
Oh, yeah, yes. So, and it is very notable that he's in Georgetown just a few months before Isabella is here. So I'm going to bring in one more character. His name is William H. Cushman. A lot of you probably know him for various reasons in his history to Georgetown. But we're only going to talk about him in the context of Green Lake. So he is the owner and proprietor of Green Lake. He is credited for having started the first fish hatchery in Colorado. We could do an entire history talk on him, but just remember his name for this next slide. So I stumbled upon something very odd continuing the research. A discovery was made in 2018 by an Estes Park historian. He says, according to Larimer County records, so that's up in Estes Park, James Nugent, Rocky Mountain Jim, was in Georgetown to sell his Muggins Gulch property to Cushman for $1,000. To me, that does not make any sense. But in the context of Isabella Bird, we're kind of creating this web of connections. It does pose more questions than answers, such as, was Cushman encouraging Isabella to write about Green Lake as a destination to bolster tourism, or was she merely drawn to it for personal matters? I don't really know, but I found this very, very interesting. I think one thing that we can very safely assume that Rocky Mountain Jim, while he was in Georgetown, went to Green Lake because of his association with Cushman, and at the very least recommended Isabella has to go see it, and recommends that she go see Green Lake. So how did Isabella get to Green Lake? I found this amusing article from 1871, and it tells this sort of story about this journalist's experience going up there. But he says that the lake is accessible by carriage, horseback, or foot and walker. The article goes on to say, if you're so penny-wise as to undertake the latter, that's foot and walker, you hike there, you will become overwhelmed with a sense of sublime ridiculousness long before you get there. So don't walk. So this is actually the real answer. I'm not going to read it all, but I did find this newspaper article that, very much in detail, laid out Cushman's personal property, and that tells us what Green Lake Road was, where it was. But just in layman's terms, you start at the Rutherford Trail, you cross over what is now present-day Quinella Pass Road, follow the creek to Green Lake. In my research, I read this really wonderful book called Following Isabella. It was published in 2009, and I was delighted by the author's extreme trepidation to drive up Quinella Pass to reach Green Lake. Now, in his defense, it was winter. There were signs saying, road conditions are bad, use caution. So our author actually pulls off on a switchback, waits for cars to pass him, and then to come back down. That gives him insurance that they didn't fly off the cliff or get stuck in the snow. And he does make it to Green Lake, and it's all good. But, of course, I was just thinking, if Isabella had the luxury of convenience to take a scenic byway to Green Lake, her book would be a little bit different. But this is what she does say about getting to Green Lake. She writes, I struck upwards into the icy solitudes. Sheets of ice at first, then snow, over a foot deep, pure and powdery, then a very difficult ascent through a pine forest, where it was nearly dark, the horse tumbling about in deep snowdrifts. But the goal was reached, and none too soon.
And interestingly, you can see James Grafton Rogers' future home in the background of this photo. That's his Aspen Grove here at the bottom of Silver Gulch. And this is our present day Rutherford Trail. And this photo has a date of, I think, 1875 on it.
So this is by William Henry Jackson. It does date us a little bit later than after Isabella was here. We can also tell from some of those buildings as well. But yes, the photograph does say Road to Green Lake or Green Lake Road. So what did Isabella do at Green Lake? She marveled. the lake is frozen solid. It's winter. This is a popular, destination, and she's the only person there. So she's observing this beautiful landscape and completely alone. So what she says, to quote her, she says, "It brought to mind the verse, 'The darkness is past, and the true light now shineth.'" She goes on to quote a poem while she's up there. The poem is "The Sleep" by Victorian poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And it goes, "O earth, so full of dreary noises, O men with wailing in your voices, O delved gold the wailer's heap, O strife, O curse that o'er it fall, God strikes a silence through you all, He giveth his beloved sleep." So here Isabella is highlighting the duality of looking around at all of this natural beauty above ground, while men are blasting away deep underground in mining operations, and really coming to terms with the duality, how both of those things can exist in the same place. This photo is also William Henry Jackson. It is of Green Lake during winter. I love it. This would have been very much like what she would have seen minus the dashing man in the boiler hat. So Isabella departs Georgetown after that. Winter marches on in Estes Park, and she writes, "My hair, which was thoroughly wet with the thawed snow of yesterday, is hard frozen in plates. Half our floor is deep in snow, and it's so cold that we cannot open the door to shovel it out. It blows in through the cracks and dusts this letter while I write." So she departs to Colorado in December, and A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountain goes on to be her most famous book. However, her travels and achievements do not stop there. So I've put just on a single slide now multiple lifetimes of achievements and adventures. We see just a few years after she is in Colorado, her beloved Henrietta, her sister, passes away. The next year, she marries a Scottish surgeon, John Bishop. Then, very sadly, 5 years after that, he passes, and she actually dedicates herself to a medical missionary cause. She studies medicine at St. Mary's Hospital in London. And then she continues to travel the world: India, Tibet, Persia, Middle East, Japan, China, Korea. In 1892, she's the first woman elected to join the Royal Geographic Society, which is a huge, huge honor. And then 5 years later, she's elected to the Royal Photographic Society. And this latter portion of her life, she's traveling with hundreds, maybe 100 pounds of photographic equipment. She is one of the earliest travel photographers. She's using the night sky as her darkroom as she processes and develops and prints photographs. So it's really extraordinary. Then in 1901, she has her final expedition to Morocco. And on October 7th, 1904, she passes away just shy of her 73rd birthday. And even in those final days, she was still planning her next trip to China. So her legacy is vast, but so vast. She has broken so many norms for Victorian ladies and has paved the way for future female explorers. She's published a handful of travel books. She's featured in magazines, pamphlets, and just as recently as last year, she was celebrated in Estes Park for 150 years of achievements. So in popular culture, we see her in documentaries, a Japanese comic book starring her, a handful of plays, and even maybe some of you in this room, 1994, the play Dear Desperado. Okay, yes, featuring or talking about Isabella Bird and Rocky Mountain Gym. And what that looked like was performed in this community center. So if anyone has a script, maybe.
I was just thinking about that today. Who has that?
I couldn't find hardly any information about it, but was delighted that it happened. So, and then on this screen we have the Isabella Bird Community School in Denver. They're doing a lot of great work. Very unfortunately, their mascot is not a horse. It's a dragon. So to sum it all up, the Spectator said it best. There never was anyone who had adventures as well as Miss Bird.
All right.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to pass the mic to John.
All right. Let's see, can you hear me okay? All right, good. All right, was the play any good, Lynette?
Yeah, it was fun.
Oh, yeah?
It was very
Okay.
fun.
Okay, I'd love to hear more about it. We couldn't find much else about it besides one article, so, okay. Oops. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about James Grafton Rogers, or as Governor Love of Colorado called him, a humanist of the deepest and widest tradition. I hope you'll see why throughout the presentation. Also, I hope you enjoyed Allison's very beautiful and graphical presentation. She said that mine looked haunted. I had to put together this timeline of his life. There wasn't really one good definitive timeline of all the things that he was involved in, just to keep my own facts straight, but I split his life up into a couple different eras. The early years, where in his 20s, he's getting started as Assistant Colorado Attorney General. He's doing a lot of his songwriting and things around that time. Founds the Colorado Mountain Club in that time. Is in his early legal career. He joins every social club in Denver around that time. Starts to ascend through his law career in the middle of his career, but also starts to get involved in some of his more important federal positions like Assistant U.S. Secretary of State. Ascends to the height of his legal and education career as a master at Timothy Dwight College. And he's always doing multiple, these all overlap, by the way. He's always doing 2 or 3 different positions at once, which is impressive. Then he gets into his more important federal positions with the OSS, which is a precursor to the CIA. And he's got some pretty exciting things that he did there. Age 59, he's essentially starting an early precursor to the CIA. The Hoover Commission at age 65, and then finally, the most important to us, right, Mayor of Georgetown at age 70. I'll get into all this a little bit more later. Allison said Rocky Mountain Jim's the most interesting man in the world. I think James Grafton Rogers might qualify as well, just on this photo alone. But I put together, I was shocked by just how many different descriptors and job titles and things that he had collected and had been described by over time. Everything from international financier to military intelligence expert to poet to attorney and reporter, mountaineer, naturalist. It goes on. Okay, there it goes. All right. Okay. I also put this together and take a close look at this, but this is all of the clubs and organizations and jobs, occupations that he ever had, as far as I could find. And there was also no definitive list of this either, but there's quite a few. Everything from the World Peace Foundation to the Georgetown School Board. And like I said, every social club in Denver, New York, and Yale. As well as fun informal ones like the Saturday Afternoon Drinking Society, which was an informal one with his buddies during Prohibition, so he had an adventurous spirit as well. His early years, I'll go by some of this pretty quickly, I want to get to the Georgetown stuff, but he completed his early education in Denver. His parents sent him off to boys' school in New Hampshire. He graduated from Yale in 1905 with many honors, class poet, editor of 3 periodicals, 6 different fraternities and secret societies. He couldn't stop. He started at the New York Sun as a reporter right after graduating, and learned pretty quickly that he didn't like that occupation. Came back to Colorado and graduated from Denver Law School in 1908, and then married his wife, Cora May Peabody, in 1910, who was daughter of Governor James Peabody of Colorado, so very influential connection early on for him. And not as early, but just want to know, he enlisted in the military then during World War I at age 35, and became an artillery officer and tactics instructor, but that'll be important later. Briefly, his legal career, like I said, he maybe from connections based on his wife, he became an assistant attorney general of Colorado at the age of 26. a very high-profile position early on, and then went into private practice with a number of different firms. And some of these Rogers early on are not him until later. There were other influential and famous lawyers and powerful connections for him. His law specialties were, he was counsel for a lot of banks, interstate water contracts, as well as railroad and utility law. And like I said, he ascended through his career then pretty quickly, going more into education and law governance. Professor at University of Denver throughout his private practice years, president of the Colorado Bar, then dean of law at University of Colorado, and finally then moved out east to be master at Timothy Dwight College and professor of law at Yale at the same time, age 52 to 59. Let's see, and then, so early in his career, this is in his 20s, he founds the Colorado Mountain Club. He begins with a shared idea between Enos Mills, who was one of the early settlers in Estes Park. Enos Mills comes there at age 15 to Estes Park, about 10 years after Isabella Bird leaves, actually. So Rogers meets with Enos Mills in Estes Park, and Enos Mills convinces him that we need this sort of concept of like-minded outdoor enthusiasts. Rogers publishes a letter in the Denver newspaper putting out a call out for like-minded outdoorsy individuals. He gets 7 responses, written responses. And at the first meeting, they have 25 attendees in 1912, and they elect Rogers, of course, to be the first president of the CMC, which persists to this day, and they're pretty instrumental in education. You can go take a backcountry ski class or avalanche education from CMC. But they were very instrumental early on, and Rogers did this in his 30s, but helped with creating Rocky Mountain National Park, kind of with partnership between Enos Mills and many other folks. But Rogers was responsible for writing the legislation and doing the research, did a lot of the legal legwork. Enos Mills is considered to be the godfather of Rocky Mountain National Park, but some folks, even I found some articles from a former Estes Park historian that suggested that Rogers should essentially be a co-equal with Enos Mills as far as the effort and strife that Rogers put into it. Rogers wrote that it was one of the most strenuous and difficult endeavors of his life, though that was early in his career that he wrote that. This is a photo of Rogers at an early Colorado Mountain Club meeting in his 20s. There's him in the middle with a woman, very, very Isabella Bird-like there in the middle. It's not her, of course, but cool photo. His government career I'll breeze through, but like I said, he started as Assistant Attorney General in Colorado, and then later was Assistant U.S. Secretary of State in the Hoover administration in the Depression era. Then, after he sort of, I'll get into this more, but he suddenly quit at Yale during the height of his legal career and was drafted into starting the OSS. He did some other important work like the Allied Electoral Mission to Greece, which was an election monitoring mission. He was part of the Hoover Commission at age 75, and then most importantly, mayor of Georgetown at age 70. So his pre-OSS time, I'll go through this briefly. He was teaching at Yale. He was interested in what was going on in 1939. It was pre-World War II. He went to Germany essentially as a tourist spy, more or less. He was hanging out with German troops, getting information on their training and organization, and having debates with them. He spoke German. But he left just as war was declared and had to be flown home from London as a refugee. But when he came back home, he brought his learnings to the Secretary of War and General Marshall, at the time, where they met very likely in Georgetown at his home that he had recently purchased to discuss what he had learned while he was essentially a civilian spy in Germany. And they discussed all types of important things such as forming the 10th Mountain Division, and also discussed starting the civilian spy agency that became the OSS. Just interestingly, he wrote a letter to the president, FDR, at the time about, Rogers sort of incepted this idea along with another guy I won't talk about to start this early sort of CIA, but FDR ignored him. FDR did not like James Grafton Rogers, apparently.
So he resigned from Yale and received an offer to join a variety of government services due to his experience. But he chose to join and help start the OSS, which, like I said, was an early predecessor of the CIA, long gone now, right? But he was tasked with essentially starting the thing up from scratch. He worked on planning and organizing military intelligence efforts, espionage and political intrigue, as he put it, guerrilla support. He wrote in his notes that he made several trips with British agents into the behind enemy lines. So he was doing some pretty wild stuff at age 59. He had to fight for the survival of the OSS itself, using his relationship with General Marshall. General Marshall asked him if he would take charge of the agency, actually, and he declined. He thought that him taking charge would destroy the agency, but he did offer to help it give more order and discipline, and became part of what was called a board that was overseeing the OSS called the Strategic Services Planning Group. He resigned from the OSS, though, only 2 years after he started it, because he wrote he felt the war was in the hands of the folks overseas, and his services and many others in Washington were no longer needed. And most important to us, when his time as mayor at Georgetown and life in Georgetown, he bought his home in Georgetown on the recommendation of his son, Ranger Rogers. In 1941, his son scouted the location and thought Dad might like it. And then he almost immediately, that was the same, essentially right as World War II was starting, right? So he had to move almost immediately back to Washington to start the OSS, and then he went to New York thereafter to work for the Foreign Bondholders Protective Council. And then finally, at age 70, he retired and moved to Georgetown in full time. It was a pretty big deal, as I heard at the time, and as I read in Christine Bradley's book. But it would be sort of like if Obama was coming back to town and didn't have anything better to do except for be your mayor. And so he was kind of put up to it, as people are in Georgetown, I found out. As things happen here. But he was very gracious, and he was elected unanimously, which I believe has never happened before. And he served a second term as well after a short break. But he had faced some major issues during his mayoral tenure. And, none of these were solo efforts. He didn't do this all by himself, right? But he did have a pattern of pulling in his connections and using his political acumen to help get the town over the goal line for some of these major problems. For example, the fire department was wildly underfunded and had very poor equipment at the time. He used his banking connections from his previous career as a lawyer to help the town get a loan at a very low rate. This is his mayoral acceptance letter. I'll read it here for you. Just kidding, I transcribed it. I like he wrote, this was put in the town paper. He said, "I have no desire to hold any more public offices, but Mrs. Rogers and I have a deep interest in the town where we live, and I'm willing to accept the post if you want me to. I'm resigning next week the duties in New York and Washington, which have kept me away from home, except for occasional trips. I expect to be home pretty constantly after the middle of April. If elected, I can give a reasonable amount of time to your interests this year. Mrs. Rogers and I are proud and grateful for your confidence in us, so many of the people of Georgetown have expressed in recent days." Though in a letter that he wrote to Marcellus Merrill, who was a businessman who lived in town, he did have some doubts about his leadership and doubts about what the town folk thought of him. He wrote that he felt that some people thought he was a sort of aristocrat who don't feel their workaday problems need a lot of new understanding. So even though he was a great mayor, he had his doubts. The sewer issue, or lack thereof, or rather lack of a sewer disposal plan, we were getting a lot of flack from the state government at the time. A lot of nasty letters were received about the condition of Clear Creek, and pushing us and every other town in Colorado at the same time to clean up our waterways. I like this quote from a letter from the Georgetown Civic Association to Rogers, that the recent outbreak of hepatitis in near epidemic proportions in Georgetown provide evidence of the urgency of the situation. Rogers essentially was able to kick the can down the road until after his mayoral tenure. He wrote back to the he wrote back to the Colorado legislature, "We have no municipal sewer system, and what we do have flows directly into Clear Creek. Clear Creek falls rapidly, and no other town lies within about 5 miles, conveniently for getting to Mont. We have no plans for a disposal plant, and the requirement would, I think, paralyze the town due to our low budget." So he was able to push, get the state of Colorado off our back, and they were able to fund that shortly after his tenure. Zoning was another one of his major accomplishments. He did a lot of the research around the legislature and the ability of our territorial government to adopt zoning regulation. There's an interesting, this is from Marcellus Merrill to Rogers in a letter, where maybe Marcellus incepts this idea to Rogers, and maybe to the town in history, but he says, "If we move now, Mayor, Georgetown will find itself in a very enviable position in a few years. It might be possible you find people traveling to visit Georgetown as they now travel to Williamsburg." I also like, Rogers wrote up portions of this document I found called the Georgetown Plan. There's a few choice quotes here, but he was very concerned about the exploitation of Georgetown due to our lack of zoning protections at the time. He wrote this, "The town should avoid shoddy and honky-tonk developments of the sort some mountain towns have welcomed. Rodeos, races, and carnivals, which last a day or two, are common now, but are expensive of time and work, yield almost nothing to the merchants, cheapen the town, and discourage the residents of desirable families." I think you would have liked pond hockey at the time. Not too honky-tonk. Zoning was later passed in 1959, at the end of his second tenure. Georgetown Lake, he worked with the Georgetown Civic Association to pressure the state game and fish department to repair it the first time after it washed out in 1952, before his first tenure. They repaired it poorly, unfortunately, and then it washed out again a few years later, or 1 year later rather, in between his two mayoral tenures. And then unfortunately it took 15 years for the state to repair it again. But I like this quote from Christine Bradley's book, from the mayor of Idaho Springs at the time after the dam had washed out and caused major damage throughout the county. "We definitely don't want a new lake up in Georgetown just for a bunch of lousy fish. Unless we have some assurance the thing won't wash out again." Thank you, Idaho Springs. The Hotel de Paris, of course not a solo project. Some speculation that this might have come through as a result of his wife being a member of the Colonial Danes, or maybe it was just serendipity, but Rogers was president of the State Historical Society at the time he was mayor, so very influential in historic preservation already. Rogers met with the Danes in 1953 and suggested the Hotel de Paris as a potential project, and the purchase was completed by the end of his first term. Hopefully that's all correct. I like this proclamation that he put out, and I'll read part of it here. This was about a town cleanup day. He says, "Nature gave Georgetown a splendid seat in which to sit. For the rest, our town is what we make and keep it. This year, the town council will use all its means to put our house in order, bury what is ugly, remove what offends, and protect and improve what is good. The council can do a little, the people together can do wonders if they will." I think we ought to copy and paste that letter. Maybe that's, is town cleanup on the 25th? Maybe this is a genesis, but I like it. He says, "Sweep your stuff in the street and the marshal will get it." After all the important and stressful things he did throughout his life, settling the German war debt, espionage behind enemy lines, he wrote, had to deal with day-to-day things in town as well. This letter he wrote to Bernard Buckley, I'll paraphrase. "Your horse injures property and endangers children and threatens injury on the public highways. It is insecure, illegal, and cruel. The marshal has warned you repeatedly. If this animal is found at large again in town, the marshal is instructed to arrest and bring you for trial before the police judge." And he adds, "Very truly yours." And my favorite part part, his house, right? That's how we all relate to each other in Georgetown, right? Where's your house at? His home was built by Robert Orchard Olds. I've seen it referred to as the R.O. Olds house at least once. But Rogers bought it in 1941, like I said, on the suggestion of his son, Ranger Rogers. This is one of the earliest photos I could find of the house. You can see how bare the hillside is in the background, just this one sad tree. At first I thought it wasn't the same house because it doesn't have this reading room type addition in the front, but the fence is the same, the setting is the same. But the house was moved to 2nd Street, where it sits now, in 1965 during the construction on the highway. From Katie Lee's book, which Christine, thank you for suggesting to me, he says to Katie Lee while she's interviewing him, we won't be here this time next winter. This is 1961. The new interstate highway is coming through the middle of the house, and Cora and I will be moving to Denver in the spring. Cora's health is not too good. I believe it will be better for us and the city. So they leave Georgetown in 61. Okay, so a couple photos. I've asked a number of people this question over time because I was always curious, where was his house? And I got a variety of answers. Some correct, some incorrect. But I got a couple photos that show exactly where it's at. It's really right at the mouth of Silver Gulch where it spits out, and a bit to the south, a hair to the south. But this is a view looking north, and you can see where it's at here. And this photo is the best, I think, a publicity photo of Silver Gulch, where it shows just right at the very base of Silver Gulch here, and just to the left or to the south. It says Aspen Grove, though. You can see why he wrote about solitude. He says he was about a 30-minute walk from the downtown, but you can see he's kind of all out off here in the corner of town. Photo up the front of his house, you see it's got this reading room added to the front of it, and the hillside's looking a lot less bare. Nice photo view from the front of his house with this little fountain feature, very lovely. View from the reading room. View across the valley, looking at most of our houses now. And where it sits now, at the end of 2nd Street, on your way, last house on your way up to Guanella Pass. And what we know is, some of us know, is our friend Mission Ashley and their family's home. And I talked to them and about it, and there's nothing in their home like that says James Grafton Rogers was here or anything like that. As far as historical, they haven't torn the drywall off or anything, but they say there's no trace. Okay, and on to Rogers' book, My Rocky Mountain Valley. I call it his love letter to Georgetown. It ought to be required reading. If you live here, they have to just hand you a copy when you move. But it's his day-to-day observations about the seasons, the weather, the history, nature, and of our Clear Creek Valley. And he published this in '68 at age 85, just 3 years before his passing. Mine is signed. I just ordered it off Amazon, and I was shocked to open the cover and find Roger's signature. But I think it says, to Douglas Draper, his P's are a little suspect. This says pipe, so that's a piece. But it says, to go with the corncob pipe and much of remembrance. I don't know if anybody knows Douglas Draper. Yeah, okay, all right. I'll have to ask you more for it. Apparently they're not that rare though. Christine has a signed copy, and Tom Elliott's got a signed copy as well. But great book. I'll share a couple passages that I enjoyed with different observations that I thought were interesting. But he writes one called Mountain Sheep. Says, the sheep are always on the west side of our deep valley. We're here. No one has ever seen a sheep on the east side of the gorge, which we all know has long changed after they were introduced to Mount Evans. One about tourists or visitors. He says, some visitors I find are uneasy in our canyons. People from the plains or from the sea. The walls of the mountains seem to menace them. An earthquake might collapse the cliffs, crush the houses, block the highways, and imprison them. These sensations never trouble me, but wind in the mountains stir me. I pace the house uneasily and look to see if the old trees still stand and the buildings still survive. I trust the buildings, but I don't know if anybody else watches the pictures. The big trees are still there when it's windy. I check them constantly. One chapter he writes about our solitude in the valley, and I'm sure it was at the time without I-70, I can only imagine. There's solitude in our aspen grove on the mountainside. Most nights the lights of a village sparkle in the distance. Keep in mind he's almost, he's pretty far from town actually. Once in a while, the rumble of a heavily laden truck as it climbs to the pass reaches up the hillside. How some things never change, right? One can walk to little shops in half an hour and ride in less, or telephone in a moment. But days go by without a human voice to hear, and a week without a visitor to knock at the door. Our isolation is what we choose. And this chapter you'll like if you're a gardener in Georgetown. A new plant has invaded our valley. It's coming as recent, indeed within a dozen years, although it has spread widely in patches on the eastern sunny slopes near Georgetown. Its tangled low bushes interlace among cinquefoil. It is a yellow clematis, aka the most horrid plant that we have here in our valley. If you're a gardener, you know that it's an awful plant to get rid of. It's like our kudzu here. I like he dates it though, it coming within a dozen some odd years. I've read maybe earlier. Also, he just briefly on his playwriting, poet, and songwriting. He did a lot of this early in his 20s. He wrote a lot of what I'll call legal bedtime reading, but My Rocky Mountain Valley is well worth it, I would say. He wrote a number of plays in his 20s that were performed in the Cactus Club in Denver. And he wrote a couple what are considered old standard cowboy songs in his 20s. One, Old Dolores, as well as another one called the Santa Fe Trail. Santa Fe Trail was written about by a singer named Ian Robb. He said, the Santa Fe Trail is an ersatz but charming cowboy song written in 1911 by a lawyer who later became a big wheel in the Depression-era Hoover administration. He should probably have stuck to writing songs. Katie Lee, in her book, 10,000 Goddamn Cattle, she writes, she was interviewing Rogers about the song after tracking him down, about his songs after tracking him down. She says to Rogers, the Santa Fe Trail was stolen early on. The town of Old Dolores acquires a new author every year. Doesn't that upset you? He replied, oh, I think anyone can find out that I wrote them. Many people know I did. He doubt people make any money off of his little songs, and when he gets requests to use them, if they're not suited for it, he just says no. He kind of threw these out into the public domain, it seems almost, and he didn't take a lot of credit for these songs throughout a career, throughout his life. He wasn't a performer, but these are still, you look these up, there's hundreds of versions of either of these songs to this day. So to wrap things up, I just want to play the first verse of Old Dolores, which I know a number of folks have told me that they know the song. Actually, Christine does a great version that she sent me with George Downing that was awesome. So we're going to do the first verse, and if you know the words, sing along. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Or 40s or 30s, I guess it was, that far back. He was Assistant Secretary of State during the Hoover administration. A statesman. And he writes this wonderful, simple, beautiful little song about an old gold mining town in New Mexico called Old Dolores. In the country down below, where the little piñons grow, and it's nearly always half a day to water, there used to stand a town where a creek come tumbling down from the mesa where she surely had an daughter. Her streets was bright with candlelight, and the whole town joined the chorus, and every man in sight let his cattle drift at night, just to mosey to the town of Old Dolores.
All right, good job. All right, Old Dolores is not Georgetown. It may as well be. It's a town in New Mexico that Katie Lee tracks down. But briefly, while I was doing my research, I tried to talk to a number of folks in town who had met Rogers personally. Cora Lou, who also shares the name of Rogers' wife, Cora. just coincidentally. And Smokey as well had met Rogers in person. They both related their memories of delivering groceries to Rogers as a teenager. They both remembered, they both had great memories of his swing set, a large pipe swing set. I see Smokey nodding. Both stuck out to you both. It must have been extremely impressive, I can only imagine, but very cool. I also spoke to Bob Gibbs, who came here in 1960. And I asked Gibbs, and Gibbs had met him quite a few times at the Alpine. He said that Rogers would go get lunch there and have a martini with lunch, typically. And Gibbs did admit that he was a bit of a ski bum at the time. Gibbs was 21, and he said he had other things on his mind rather than getting to know Rogers better, but he wished he would have, and he was certainly impressed by Rogers' gravitas at the time. So thank you for sharing those memories with us. I thought that was really neat. Okay, any questions for Allison or me about Rogers or Isabella Bird? No questions? We answered every single thing. Yeah.
When Isabella Bird was here, was the Opera House existing?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure if my timelines, I remember the Cushman Opera House, the Cushman Theater would have been built. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
After Rogers' house was moved, did him and Cora end up moving down to Denver, or did they reside in the house for purposes?
They moved to Denver before the house was moved. Yeah, they moved to Denver in 61, and from what I could find, the house was moved in 65. Oh, yeah, Ruth.
Who are you researching next, and when will you have another show?
I may do another one next year. I've been wanting to do one about the Silver Plume Gondola, which a lot of people don't.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm actually, just to get it on record, I'm very interested in the photographic history of Georgetown. I saw that there was even a photo studio, so I would love to do something on that.
We can talk.
Yeah.
What month would you like?
Any other questions?
You just did so much research, it's wonderful.
Thank you. This is the only research project I've ever had to do in my entire life where all the information was not on the internet. It took me back to the encyclopedia days. Roger's Wikipedia article is about 3 sentences, so I may have to update it. But okay, so we've got some giveaways here briefly. So who would like a copy of My Rocky Mountain Valley who has not read it? Raise your hand. Okay, good. Small handful of books. Okay, good. All right. So remember the slide. They had all of the organizations and clubs and things that Rogers was in throughout his life. Okay, so raise your hands here, and now guess how many things that he was involved in. But I'm gonna. It looks like there's about 8 people. How many, Amy?
42.
Okay.
9.
Okay.
The club's 9.
Oh, all organizations.
All of them. The
All of
whole
them.
page?
Yeah.
56.
Okay.
Just the one slide.
Okay.
75.
Okay. Any more? Okay. Any more?
61.
Okay.
69.
Okay. Okay. Any more? Okay, it was 58. So you get one. I think Lynette. I think Lynette and somebody else said 60 some odd.
Do these have the signature in them?
No, these are not signed unless you want. Yeah, there you go. Jeff. Unless you want me to sign it.
Okay, we still have more stuff. So the James Grafton Roger book budget was higher than the Isabella Bird book budget. I just have one. So this will be a fierce competition. So how I'm going to do it, so I'm going to ask a question, and it's just the first person who can just tell me the answer. If you want this book, if you don't already own it. So the question for the book is, what year was Isabella Bird in Georgetown?
1873.
1873.
We did plan for a tiebreaker. But I heard Amy, and then there was one back here. We'll talk. I did hear it a little louder. But we'll talk with the other person that I heard too. I can get you one.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you.